On the Security Weekly News, I try to scan and produce a quick look at some of the major stories to help you keep up with what's going on in and around the industry in a short format. Myself, Aaron Leyland, Josh Marpet, and other guest commentators provide greater insight every week. I'm Doug White, and I hope that you'll look for the Security Weekly News in all of your favorite podcast catchers and subscribe for the latest content.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. That's right, it's the Security News. I'm very excited. You can follow along on securityweekly.com/PSW-833. Mr. Sam Bound has joined us. Sam, welcome.
Good evening. Happy to be here.
Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome.
Hey, it's good to be here. It's freaking Wednesday.
It is Wednesday, and I'm excited for the security news. Josh Marpet has joined us as well. Josh, welcome.
Of course. I love being here.
And the other Josh Bressers has joined us as well, stuck around. Josh, thanks for sticking around, man.
Yeah, I wouldn't miss it for anything. I mean, two Joshes
right.
is confusing.
I mean, what's better than the only thing better than one Josh is two Joshes. And we have a Jeff, Mr. Jeff Mann, from the cabin, which is great. I love it.
It is great.
I want to kick off this segment by, let's talk about things that make me mad. Things that make me mad. In the category of things that make me mad, there was...
Things that make you mad for 800, Paul.
Things that make me mad for 800. So Lemon It Up is the Twitter/X account that essentially said this person found a vulnerability in a piece of software, disclosed that vulnerability responsibly, I would say. We talk about, different levels of disclosure. Said, hey, I found a vulnerability in your software. And they came back with a letter that was essentially like a legalese for a cease and desist. Hey, it even started off basically thanks for disclosing that vulnerability to us. Also, you could be in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and we may sue you for that. And so therefore, you should never talk about that. And that situation, 1,000% of the time, makes me really, really mad. I don't think we should be sitting here in 2024 talking about this type of response from a vendor. Sam is, I can tell Sam is it was like a wind-up toy. I was winding Sam up for a rant.
I've given talks about this. This is white hatting. I've done it a ton. This is all you ever get. I mean, the success rate of white hatting is 2%. And they threaten you with stuff. If a company is too stupid to have a bug bounty program, there's no point telling them anything. But he hasn't been doing this too long, I guess, if he's surprised by this.
I don't think he was necessarily surprised by it. I think he was surprised by the language in the letter. And again, you can go to our show notes and read the letter. I read the letter and I was like, oh my God, if there ever was a time to go back 20 years ago where I was YOLO, just release the vulnerability and exploit for this company. This would be it. Just out of me being pissed off. I did this on my own time. I found the vulnerability. I disclosed it. I'm you should fix this. And then they were well, we're going to Josh Wright. I love Josh so much. The different Josh, not Bressers or Marpet, but Josh Wright. And Josh.
Love them too.
But I also love Josh Wright and his description of doing disclosure when it goes wrong, described the ninja lawyers rappelling down ropes on helicopters to your house, right? To issue the cease and desist or whatever it is, comes to mind. I thought we were over this, right? And obviously we're not.
No, I got one of these from Staples when I reverse engineered their app, and I found out how to extract the password from their stupid stored password on the Android phone. And then they sent me a letter saying, the terms of service say you can't reverse engineer the app. And I said, terms of service? I never looked at them. So I opened it, and the first thing it says in screaming letters is you can't reverse engineer the app. So I asked my lawyer, and he said, that's garbage. What you're doing is fair use. So I just ignored them, and they went away. If this guy has a lawyer, I think you get the same answer. I mean, you tell them, you wait 30 days or 60 days or something, and after that, I don't think they've got a leg to stand on for asking.
I hate to see this person pay for a lawyer. I would contribute if there was a GoFundMe. I would contribute 1,000%. Right?
Well, sure, but if you're going to do white hatting, you need to have a lawyer.
No, I agree.
And look, one of the challenges in the U.S. is there's a guy on YouTube I love called Legal Eagle, which if anyone has ever watched, like he's phenomenal. But he said like the best thing about the United States is you can sue anyone, and the worst thing about the United States is you can sue anyone.
Agree.
And this is one of those things like you could be completely correct, you could release the vulnerability information, and they could take you to court and bankrupt you. Right?
Yeah, no,
It
that's
sucks,
the thing,
but
dude.
It's
Yeah,
one of the
you're
challenges.
Not if you have a good, competent lawyer and you're willing to cooperate with him. I mean, the lawyers at the EFF, I got one of them I work with, they could get you. In fact, he told me that. He said, even if you release something, as long as there's some good in what you did and it's not totally malicious, then he can defend it as free speech.
Oh,
The
you're
only
making
way-
me
the only
want.
way
See,
that
but
should
now
get
you're making me
convicted is-
want to bring an attorney on from the EFF to
Sure.
talk about, which we have done in the past, right? Like I
That
want
would
to
be
just go
great.
down this path again because
Sure.
I mean,
This
as
keeps
everyone
coming
knows, like
up.
I'm all for the hackers. I'm all for like the greater good. Like this person was not acting maliciously, in my
No,
opinion,
but
right?
this is
Like
essentially political
Ugh.
activism. And every new generation of hackers tries doing this. I did it too when I was new. It seems like the thing to do. And some good legal advice would definitely be good for them.
I tell you what, though, the support on X for this person is amazing. And when I read the responses to this post, like it like backed up my faith in our community, in our industry, because I recognized so many of the accounts, like Casey Ellis and so many others are just like responding. Jericho was one of the folks that responded, right? Like the support, and I responded back to this person, and I'm like, dude, that sucks. If there's anything we can do to help, like just let us know. Like we're on your side on this particular disclosure. So
There was one thing I was thinking about when I was looking at this is that I agree that, white hat is all legit and everything, but before you go at something, take a look at what their VDP stuff says, because you might get a heads up on where you might get some crap back, even if what you're doing is 100% legit.
right.
You
Would
decide
that,
whether you want to go
change
there.
Lee, would that change your approach?
No, but
Right?
eyes open.
Like-
I mean, it's like Sam. If he'd read that thing that says "Don't do this," he might
Like
have
you'd still do it,
called-
right? Like you,
right, but he might
because
have
we're
called
still
the
for
lawyer
the greater
first.
good. Like we're still.
Yeah, I agree.
You got to fix this stuff, right?
Right, but if they said,
Or you
go ahead.
you publish to the full disclosure mailing list or whatever the equivalent is now anonymously.
Oh, dude, I'm all for like,
Oh, sweet,
dude, like, but like so many times I'm all for like the YOLO, like just if you're gonna be like litigious and sue everyone, I'm gonna be like, well, I'm just gonna put it out there, right? Like I hate to
Well,
be
you
like,
know-
I hate to be like, there's this conflict, like there's a lot of friction at play in a lot of these situations, but at the end of the day, the security researcher really controls the narrative. As much as the corporation wants to control the narrative, the security researcher really doesn't control the narrative in that, okay, like maybe you're gonna sue me regardless, but I'm gonna put it out there. Right. And it's gonna be a bad day. It's gonna be a bad day for you, and you're gonna look bad. Like everyone's holding cards. Yeah, it's so we could talk about disclosure. Disclosure is just such a glorious topic in this sense,
Well,
right?
I think we got to mention one I didn't put in my news articles, but the Stanford Research Observatory just shut down at least partly because they got sued so much for pointing out disinformation on the web. They just said, it's not worth it. So it's a very similar issue.
Disinformation on the web. All right. I'm gonna look. The internet recently has been ruined for me because no matter where I turn, I see the young lady that does the Hawk Tua thing, right? Everyone, we all seen it. Like if you haven't seen it, like you've seen it, right? Like, and it's ruined the internet. But now part of this story. So my wife came to me and she was like, she was like, that girl lost her job. She was a preschool teacher and she lost her job. And then I'm like,
did she really?
I'm like, really? Nope, not true. Not true. That was a disinformation. To Sam's point, that was a disinformation campaign. And I'm like when we created the internet, we really wanted it to be this great thing that helps society. And I'm like, here we are talking about this poor girl that which is look, I'm gonna just come right out with it. It's freaking hilarious. But after a couple of weeks of that, like I'm done. I don't want to see anything more relevant to this meme anymore. And I certainly don't want to see disinformation, and I don't want to see this young lady suffer any harm for something she said in some stupid clip somewhere, right? Like, it's hilarious. Let's move on. But like, we can't move on. We're just going to be hung up on it. And then it has to be a disinformation campaign. And if people are being sued for the disinformation, like, that's, oh my God, Sam, like, that's.
The fact is that the information, disinformation, fact checking, litigious nature is creating an entire not just echo chambers or hyperlocal advertising, and that we were talking about for the last few years, but it's created an effect where I get better news from comedians because they employ staffs of people to actually check the news than I get from the news, which is trying to do, if it bleeds, it leads, and wag the dogs all the damn time. It's pitiful.
I used to have a bumper sticker that said, I get my news from Comedy Central, and I get my comedy from Fox News.
Okay, so I have a comment about that actually to add. There was a time Wolf Blitzer was on Jeopardy with Andy Richter, and Andy Richter kicked his ass. Like, comedians are way smarter.
Comedians are
than
awesome.
news people.
Comedians are. My wife and I went to see Nikki Glasser over the weekend, and if you're sensitive, you don't want to go see Nikki Glasser. But my wife and I got a kick out of it, right? And I like that. Like, comedy must prevail, right? Like, we need to all have a good laugh about stuff. Like, come on.
And by the way, this is nothing new. Mark Twain said he was just a preacher. And there was that famous black comedian that made all the jokes about racism in the early days. Comedians are the people who have the skill to say really offensive things and get away with it.
Yeah. I think that needs to be preserved, right? We need a good sense of humor. If there's one thing on this show that we want to preserve, we need to have a good sense of humor about things. Like, look, we're going to talk about a lot of things that could mean a bad day or more than a day for people, right? Some of what gets us through it is having some humor and entertainment value out of it.
Yeah, I've always told people I'm a college teacher. My profession is a branch of stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
All right, so here's what I'm hearing. We have to mask our vulnerability reports as parody, and then we can't be sued.
That's a great point.
No. Oh my gosh. Cool.
Oh man. And there's a lot of vulnerability reports. ASUS is in the news this week. This one was interesting. So the Taiwanese CERT issued a report on D-Link routers. Oh no. Well, I got these confused. D-Link, ASUS. The one that I looked at was actually the ASUS router vulnerability. Now, what's interesting is this talks about a particular CVE. Josh, you've been on the show talking about CVEs and talk about a lot about CVEs in
That's right.
on your show as well. And what was interesting is the initial CVE, I believe, was 2024-3079. There was an authentication bypass vulnerability that was found by I believe a Chinese, Taiwanese company. It could also be CVE 2024-3080, although I think it's 2024-3079 authentication bypass. And when I was looking into this bypass, which ASUS routers it affected, and I went to ASUS's website and I looked at the latest firmware that fixed this vulnerability, and they specifically call out that those CVEs that are for an authentication bypass, I believe. But the first thing in the release notes is fix the command injection vulnerability. No CVE mentioned. I'm like, well, that's interesting. Then they also say we fixed an ARP poisoning vulnerability. No CVE mentioned. We fixed a stack buffer overflow vulnerability in light HTTPD. No CVE mentioned. Then they call out specific CVEs that were fixed. And I'm like, what's going on in this firmware? So I downloaded the firmware. I extracted the firmware. And I started poking around. And holy crap, does this firmware have some functionality? Like, the web application for this firmware has 30 plus files of both ASP, JavaScript, all over the place. And I'm like, good Lord, this would take me weeks to analyze. Because I'm like, no one released an exploit for the vulnerabilities that I was referencing in the article. And I'm like, what is in this firmware? The firmware is really bad. And it's super complex. And it probably wouldn't take that much time to go, oh, that's the vulnerability and here's the exploit for it, right? Kind of thing. It was bad. Also, a lot of people rely on binwalk for analysis and extraction of this firmware. I find binwalk has not been so. I want to say someone forked binwalk. When I looked at what if you install binwalk in Manjaro or Arch Linux, it actually doesn't pull from the official repositories because Microsoft acquired Refirm Labs. And I think after that, they stopped kind of applying updates to their open source binwalk repository. There's someone else that's kind of maintaining the binwalk repository. And that's the one that actually gets built if you install it in Arch and Manjaro. I'm like, well, that's interesting. But the people at Unblob does an awesome job at extraction, like way better than binwalk in my experience. And I mean, this is primarily what I do in my day job. Like I look at firmware and extract firmware. And I'm like, wow, Unblob is really cool. And you can put that in a Docker container because the thing with extraction is the extraction tools have to get all the libraries and dependencies to understand all the different file systems that may exist inside the firmware. And so they have a Docker container that you can deploy on your system that has all that stuff pre-built, right? Because like you're looking at like Jefferson, if you've ever done like firmware reverse engineering, you know what I'm saying when I say Jefferson. Like it's a way of is Jefferson a compression file system or compression inside of firmware, something like that. And like it's not in most like mainline distributions. So make sure you check out Unblob and use their Docker container because it builds all that stuff in. In any case, tons of stuff, vulnerabilities in ASUS firmware. So go check it out, develop exploits, and put them on GitHub. I think that's, what we should do, right?
Paul has instructed you. You shall do it now.
You should do it. You should do it.
Develop an exploit? Are you supposed to disclose something
Yeah,
to
you
the
send
vendor?
it to me. My email address, paul@securityweekly.com. I want those exploits.
He'll post it from his I've already lawyeredup.com site.
Yes.
If it's a PCI exploit, send it to Jeff. Okay. If it's a firmware exploit, send it to Paul. If it's an academia exploit, send it to Sam.
Just quick on the firmware exploits, Zyxl NAS devices. I think was it Lee? I think you had this article, right?
Yeah, I did.
And this is an end of life firmware. Is that correct?
Yeah, this was like they actually. I think it was end of life, but it was so bad they released updates, and now there's shockingly people are going after it, and it's a shit show. I'm like, really, just replace these damn things. You're not gonna. You're just postponing the inevitable here. And I don't think they hit all the vulnerabilities. They only hit the big ones. There's still issues with the patch, even so. Well, it's like 2 years past life.
I don't know if I did a quick search or it came up in my feeds. My story number 20, though, is a Zyxl NAS CVE 2024-29973. Yeah, RCE exploit. And it's a really basic command injection. Like someone did the work to figure out that a URL structured in this way can execute commands. Someone put that in a Python script and put it on GitHub. And then a lot of the reports, like if you Google for that CVE number, 2024-29973, you'll find like a ton of articles that talk about threat actors exploiting this because it's super easy to exploit. Now, I will say, if you're wondering, like if you go to my link in story number 20 and you're wondering why the exploit's not working against your target, it's because you didn't read the exploit code. And you totally, like, you have to read the exploit code. Like, you can't just willy-nilly download exploits from GitHub and run them for a number of reasons. Like, it could exploit your system and it could not work. And the reason that this exploit doesn't work is there's no documentation on the exploit. But if you read the exploit, when they do their Python requests, they're looking at a local proxy server. And if you don't have a proxy server running on localhost in a specific port, your exploit's not going to work. And I bet you there's tons of people out there that download this exploit and are like, why isn't it working? It's because you didn't read the source code.
But that's complicated.
I know, but I read the source code and I was like, oh, I need a proxy server running on port 7940 or it's like something like that.
I mean, it's like in Sam's class. Can't we just skip all the middle work and just give me the A and I can be on my way?
People just want to be able to creating exploits is hard. Like there's a body of knowledge you have to create exploits.
Oh yeah.
You know, I was doing a CTF one time and they gave us a binary, and when you download it and run it, it destroys your machine. And I'm like, dude, I mean, I understand the point, but that is kind of rude. Of course, I was working in a throwaway virtual machine, like I tell my students you should, but I still felt kind of abused.
I mean, there's several references where I talk on podcast, this one and others, right, about downloading exploits back in the day and then the exploit not working. And that's because when they released the exploit, they purposely put bugs in the exploit so that to like raise the bar, like you had to be smart enough or willingly put in the time to debug the exploit to go, oh, I need to change this thing or that thing, right? And there's
I was going to say that's how it was back in the early days,
right? Like 2 or 3 things you had to change.
You had to know what you were doing and actually look at the code and
So-
know, oh, this shouldn't be like this.
Right? That's not the right
ChatGPT rewrite this exploit so it works.
Like you may
Sorry, cheap shot.
No, you're right. That would be an approach, but I find that ChatGPT doesn't do a great job of correcting bugs. Like typically it might fix the bug that you asked it to fix, but it introduced and or didn't fix the other bug that would make that not work, in my experience.
Yeah. And I'm fine with that. I mean, you got to have some skin in the game here.
Right. Where else do we want to go? You want to go to more firmware stuff? I think.
Well, we could do my number 3.
What's your number 3?
The 512,000 radiology patients one, just because it was medical and I could troll you. The medical breaches are crazy these days. But the other reason I picked it is because, although likely it was Quillen, that's a Russian group that did it, there's a lot of stuff that Lockbit is taking credit for that they're not necessarily true. Either it's Lockbit alikes that grab their source code, or they're just trying to rebuild their rep, even though they've been largely shut down. So I'm going, I don't think so. This doesn't feel like Lockbit. It feels like the Russian gang.
Like what software was holding their patient records? Was that also imaging information or?
Mm-hmm.
Typically.
Yeah.
What is that software? That
Epic,
does that?
Cerner, what?
Epic. Thank you. That's where my brain went, Josh, was Epic. Because my wife works in healthcare and she works at a place that uses Epic. And we've had discussions about that. And then I looked up Epic software and it's like a female founder and CEO. It's an amazing company and they make awesome. I mean, it's amazing software that manages health records, but I mean, like any other software. We all live in glass houses, right? Like none of us can claim that we can create and or work for a software company that creates perfect software that doesn't have any vulnerabilities. Okay.
That's like what I tell people. If somebody walks in and says they can make you 100% secure, kick them out of your office immediately. They're lying.
Right.
And watch out for the leftover snake oil.
But my thing with healthcare, Lee, along the lines of your story number 3 is my greatest concern is the manipulation of medical imaging and the like healthcare effects to that. In other words, and we've seen like attempts or instances of this where if you can mask the cancer in my image and I die, like that's a bad scenario. Like there is definitely a life impact to security of not just the patient records, but the images itself, right? And I've seen, and I believe it was research studies that were like, well, we could affect the images coming off of this system. And thankfully it was just research. I don't want to reach a point where there is not the level of integrity on medical images where patients' lives are at risk, right? And that's the struggle in healthcare, for sure.
Right. I mean, there's so many ways that could go bad. Even if it isn't life-threatening, you could alter it such that the procedure is completely debilitating to the person. It's just horrible.
It's hard
And
enough.
it
I
really
mean, my
sucks
wife
that they're getting
works
hit.
in this industry. Like, it's hard enough to get a good image and get the
Mhm.
radiologist to read it, kind of thing.
Mhm.
And what's interesting is they are using AI to do that. Now they don't.
Ooh, that's cool.
Yeah, and so like they don't just take face value, much like we do, right? Like if we ask ChatGPT to create a Python program, we're gonna modify it and like it's gonna have, but it's the same thing with medical imaging. It's highlighting areas that they should look at, not necessarily making the final determination of the prognosis, right? So they're using that as a tool, which is where I believe we should be using AI and LLMs today, as a tool to help you, not make
Yeah,
the
but
final decision.
I wouldn't make the assumption that it's really used that way. I mean, like all the cops used facial recognition and they were told it's just a bit of evidence to mix with others, but a lot of them would just assume it was right. And I would bet
Yeah.
hospital workers will also just assume if the AI says it's cancer, it's cancer. I mean, what good is a tool when they tell you don't trust
Right.
the tool?
Let's
That's
hope.
hard.
Let's hope not. I mean, largely radiologists go to school longer than any other doctor to be able to read that stuff. So I think they're the most scrutinous kind of bunch in my
Right.
opinion. And again, I have insights into this because of where my wife works, but
Yeah.
So what that means is once you get the AI, you can fire those expensive radiologists and just replace them with like an intern, right?
good Lord, let's hope not. In all my experience,
Bite your
and again,
tongue, buddy.
Like again, I've got great insights in this area. For all of our sakes, let's hope not. Let's hope that's never.
But there's
the
a
case.
reason why like 17 people come in when you're, waiting to get surgery for like knee replacement on your right knee, and they ask you 42 times which knee is it that
Yeah, you know why? Because
is
that's
affected,
that's
and
the
then they
call.
take a Sharpie and they put a big X on the right leg so that everybody knows we're doing the right leg.
Because wrong side surgery has cost the healthcare profession so much that it's very much a security analogy, Jeff, right? Like you're spot on. It's cost them so much that they've had to basically modify their processes to make sure that that doesn't happen. And
Well, and what they're doing effectively, which is security related, is there's always sort of a human stopgap, a human element, a human decision maker, because we don't ultimately trust all the technology, whether we call it AI or LLM or whatever.
right,
I mean, we throw the term AI around these days, and it's only been around for how many months, but I mean, I just got a new phone. My old phone finally died, so I got a new phone. So I keep getting pop-ups from all the different apps. Use AI for this. Use AI for this. We have an AI feature. I'm like, get the fuck out. I don't want to do AI anything. And it's not even AI. You're just labeling it AI.
Josh Bressers, I had a story about the Red Hat Linux kernel model is broken and can't be fixed. And I know you've talked about this in the past, right? And my question to you, and I think this really what the article is talking about is, I'm a Linux distribution and the Linux kernel team has made security fixes. Why am I not just taking those all downstream, right? Like the upstream is being fixed. I maintain a distribution. Like, why wouldn't I just take the Linux security fixes in that? Like, I don't believe that 99.9% of the distributions out there can do a better job of securing Linux kernel than the Linux security team, Linux kernel security team, or kernel developers.
Okay. So I worked at Red Hat for
Mhm.
12 years. And so I know how the sausage is made,
Right.
and I know like where all the rodents could get into the building. And this story like fascinates me because I think it is a great example of 20 years ago, things were very different than they are
Agreed.
today. And right. And so like, that's the thing, right? Like 20 years ago when Red Hat started, like I started at Red Hat in 2004. And like, I'll never forget that I worked at this small company, and my boss at one point comes up to me and he's like, "You're wasting your life on this open source crap. Like, you're a smart guy, you know, you need to work, like start doing stuff with Windows." And of course,
2004,
being young
most
and
organizations were like,
aspirational.
open source doesn't belong in our enterprise. Yeah.
Yeah,
Agreed.
right. And so I was like, no, like open source will win, and Windows is dumb and we hate Microsoft. And I mean, luckily it all worked out.
Well,
for
I
the
mean,
best,
now
but like
today,
back
to your point, Josh, today Linux is everywhere.
Right. And so the thing you have to remember is in like 2004, like the whole point of what Red Hat was doing was to, pat people on the head and tell them open source is fine and we're here to protect you and we're going to do the right thing and we're going to make sure everything is okay. And so they created this weird process for the Linux kernel that they were shipping, that they hired all these kernel developers. They spent enormous sums of money hiring people, right? And I mean, I don't know if they still are, but for the longest time, Red Hat was like the single largest contributor to the Linux kernel.
Interesting.
And they did all this work to like convince people everything was safe and good and fine. And now, 20 years later, I think you look at the way the Linux kernel works. You've got like, Greg KH doing all these CVEs for the Linux kernel, and they've got a ton of effort going to, like, Android is a great example. Android is on 4 billion devices, like billion with a B.
The thing with Android and Google is they take the upstream Linux kernel security fixes and they put them in the kernel, and then they ship Android.
Right. They're running current, right? So anyone who says we can't just take the Linux kernel and run it, we have to bring it in first and massage it and make it all pretty.
Like, the Linux kernel developers today know what they're doing. Now they know what they're doing.
Right.
And if you're maintaining a distribution, if they say this is a security fix, you should take that and apply it. Now, the other thing I heard was, and I don't know how true this is today, that the Linux kernel team used to say, well, that's a bug. It's not necessarily a security fix. And they would kind of label it as a bug. And then you're like, do I fix this bug or not knowing that there were security ramifications? Has that gotten better as we stand here today?
Well, it's different now. So historically, Linus has, we'll say, disliked security.
Like, security's like whatever.
The polite way I'll describe this.
But he was not describing it politely.
Right. No, not at all. And the Linux kernel kind of ignored security, right? They just were like, everything's a bug. We don't care. Security people, like, go stuff it. We're not going to deal with you. And so what happened was, like, all these, kernel vendors like Red Hat and SUSE and Debian and whoever, they would just get CVEs for stuff they felt like getting it for, right? There wasn't really a rhyme or reason to it. And it was all these like vendors doing this work. And then earlier this year, the Linux kernel became a CVE CNA, a CVE numbering authority, and they started coining their own CVEs. And like Greg KH is doing this work.
Great interview. And I think we talked about it last time, right? Like,
yeah.
Like, basically what we're coming down to is,
like, he's
you
amazing.
should trust the Linux kernel team to go, this is a security vulnerability. You should incorporate that in your distribution because we believe it's security vulnerability. And they're not like doing the Jedi mind tricks anymore. Like,
Right, exactly. And so, but because of the way the Linux kernel works, and we'll say I mean, you understand this, Paul, from firmware land, where it is very easy to go from what many, we'll say, software systems would consider just a bug to a security vulnerability, right? Because it's running in a very low level context.
It depends in there.
Right. So the Linux kernel is very generous with what they're calling vulnerabilities. And now you have vendors like Red Hat that have this ingrained process that they've literally like been artisanally developing for 30 years at this point. That the Linux kernel is
but basically what that means is they're missing out on the security vulnerabilities. They're not incorporating it at the rate they should be, which means if you're running a Red Hat Linux, you could be vulnerable to a kernel vulnerability.
Right, exactly. And so this is, I mean, I don't know how Red Hat's going to solve this problem.
Yeah, they have to change how they.
It's like it's very different, yes, for sure. And but at the same time, you had all these giant enterprises paying Red Hat for peace of mind and stability, right? Knowing that my kernel isn't going to change drastically,
Yeah.
knowing that my
Right.
Linux glibc isn't going to break anything. It's going to be, nice and stable for 10 plus years. And I can run my business on this and not have to fret, silly details.
Yeah, but still, you don't want to leave your business at risk to a kernel vulnerability.
And look, I think the reality is the way the kernel works now is not the way the kernel worked 20 years
agreed.
ago. And I think it is actually Debian's a good example. Like if you run Debian now, Debian just pulls the upstream kernel. They don't even try to
Debian
backport
pulls the
stuff
upstream
because
kernel. Like we
Yeah.
need to be in this. Most
It's-
distributions now
yeah.
have, to your point, Josh, have come around to, I'm just pulling the upstream.
yeah,
Right.
for sure.
But this goes back, Paul, to one of our favorite topics that we fall back on like, what are the fundamental problems? This is a trust issue.
Mhm.
Do you trust the kernel or don't you?
Right.
Red Hat's saying trust the kernel.
Well,
Only
Red
that's
Hat's
still
saying
the
trust
team
their
saying
think you have a
kernel.
choice
Red Hat's saying
anymore.
trust their
Their
kernel. The
The kernel
the
is
Linux
everywhere.
the
You
Linux
have no
Foundation
choice.
is saying trust the Linux kernel and take the security patches we produce and put them in your own custom kernels and trust
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
I trust the Linux Foundation and the Linux like most of the Linux developers today are through the Linux Foundation. Is that true?
No,
is that
not at all.
They fund like one or two
one.
kernel
So you've got
developers, right?
so Linus is like obviously in
Mhm.
charge. He is employed by the
Okay.
Linux Foundation. Greg KH, who is doing all of this crazy CVE work, he is employed by the
Okay.
Linux Foundation. And now, like one of the people working with Greg is
Mhm.
Sasha Levin. He's employed by
Mm.
Google, and so you've got people kind of
Sure.
spread out all over the place. But I would say there's a handful of big players from the Linux Foundation, but then, I mean, the Linux kernel is like an immensely successful open source project. You have people
It's
from
but
everywhere.
to that point, Josh, is an anomaly of a successful
Yes,
open
for
source
sure,
because it
for
gets
sure.
a lot of funding from a lot of different places, a lot
Yeah.
of resources,
Yeah.
and you should just, in my mind, trust that process. I hate to say implicitly trust,
yeah.
but if you think you're going to do a better job of securing the Linux kernel than the Linux kernel team today,
No,
you're sadly
nope.
mistaken, and that's where I think Red Hat is
Exactly.
falling into today, right?
Well, and it'll be interesting to see what they do, because I think they have to do something to address this, because the way they currently work, they can't keep up with the rate vulnerability. I mean, look, like Greg KH one day, I think he had like 180 vulnerabilities in one day he filed. Like the number is staggering.
Yeah, to me that was one of the turning points.
No
They
one can
became
keep
a
up.
CNA, and they were like, if it's a security vulnerability, we're going to call it that. We're going to issue a CVE because we're a CNA now, and we're off to the races. And everyone else should jump on the bandwagon and take those fixes.
Right. And there's something like 15% of the CVEs are now just from the Linux kernel.
Because it's so much code.
And it's also funny.
So much code, dude. Like
it is,
because it's
yes,
not. Is it not just the core Linux code? It's also like like the kernel team is kind of split, right?
Everything.
It's also drivers. And
everything in
all that
the
kind of
kernel.
stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And it's hilarious because there's tons of companies like losing their minds because they're saying, "Oh, the Linux kernel is like trying to burn down CVE," and I mean, maybe they are, which is a whole other conversation.
It's stuff you should fix. Like,
but at the end of the day, right, exactly. And the thing is, it's funny because they're creating so many CVEs that they're crushing a whole bunch of organizations. And part of me is like cackling with glee, and part of me is like, yes, I totally understand.
But this kind of goes back to our first segment when we were talking about vulnerability scanning and responding to vulnerability scanning findings, which largely are based on CVEs that get fed into whatever the engine is that creates a plugin and creates a reportable finding. And it's the difference between, are you responding to a finding based on a CVE, or are you doing things the way you're supposed to be doing, which is have a patch management program, which is monitoring for the detection of problems and updates and patches and fixes that solve the problem. And you do that independently and before your scan engine, if it ever is going to get a CV that responds to. But the problem is the vulnerability management companies have ingrained in most companies respond to whatever our findings are. And so many programs are based on the
Yeah.
scan findings,
Right.
which are based on the CVEs, which we've talked about previously on other
And oh god,
episodes.
I don't
Where
want to think about
what
that.
happens
Like
if there's no CVE and there's just a
right.
fix to the
But
problem?
like with Linux, I don't want to have to think about that. I want to update my distribution, and I want to have confidence and trust that they're taking in the patches for the kernel and also the firmware as well. Which Linux dash firmware is not. It's not the kernel. That's separate from the kernel development, right? This is the whole rabbit hole,
Yes.
right? And the Linux dash firmware is maintained by a different set of people who are taking firmware for thousands of different devices that exist on your systems
Yeah.
and updating that like underneath the covers on Linux. And me as IT person that wants to make sure my systems are up to date, I'm like, I gotta trust that process. And I tell you what, for the most part, it works. Like there are microcode vulnerabilities in
Yes.
CPUs that I've fixed on my systems just because I've updated my Linux distribution. I'm like, that's the way it should be. That's awesome.
So I will.
So
Some-
I have a stupid question.
Hang on
I'm
one
sorry,
second,
go ahead.
Jeff. I
Hold
apologize.
on,
Go ahead,
Josh,
Josh.
and then Jeff.
So minor bit of perspective. Zero Chaos,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a whole group of people that he hangs out with that do Arch Linux, right?
Yeah. I
And
use
they have-
Manjaro, which is like it's like Arch Linux but with training wheels.
Very well, very well said. Actually, I like that. They have to keep shelves and shelves and bookcases full of devices to test any
Mhm.
patches and everything else on, just so that they can make sure it works at least on a reasonable majority of those devices. My point is that the amount of testing that needs to be done in any variant of Linux and any variant
Yeah.
of anything
No, agreed.
is
Mhm.
out of this bloody world. And I know Zero does literally does it just to test that Pen2 will work on a lot of
With
different devices.
Yeah, devices, right.
And it's like, it's crazy. And I asked him once, I'm like, what's your process? He goes, deploy everywhere, pray a lot.
Yeah. Well, I've got a couple of articles that are kind of in this realm.
I wanted to throw a question in
Yeah,
before
go
you
ahead, Jeff.
move on, Paul. So it's a stupid question, but I'm just curious as to what people think. In the early days of all of this internet security 25, 30 years ago, the prevailing wisdom was you never would install the latest versions of anything, especially operating systems, because there were so many issues. It was always sort of expected that you would, and it was normal to be a version or two behind, and that was good because there was so much unknown. When did we make this sort of quantum shift from stay a version or two back because that's more secure, but nowadays it's the prevailing wisdom. You got to install the new things to keep up with the security patches,
When it became,
and you have to stay on the latest.
I'm not sure when. I'm not sure when, Jeff, but I think there's a spectrum of where you want to keep up to date, right? And that's kind of changed over time. And so I've changed Linux distributions based on this notion of how far up to date do I want to be, right?
Right.
And I think that's a decision for any organization and any person running Linux systems. And where I landed was I want to be in a rolling distribution because I don't want to have old crufty software that my tools that I want to use just don't work with, right? I was frustrated with Ubuntu because if I wanted the latest tool, it wasn't available through the apt repository, and I could install a snap package, and that was like I roll the dice, and then I could install what's the other one that's not snap? I'm having a mental blank. Flatpak.
Flatpak.
I guess all Flatpak, and that was a different ecosystem. And in all three cases, I'm like, how much do I trust whoever is packaging that software that it's going to work? One, two, is it a secure update for that software? And then I'm like, well, I really want a rolling release, and I don't want to be as bleeding edge as Gen 2 and like on the cutting edge of compiling all the software myself. I don't want to be in the bleeding edge of Arch and like that far forward. I want someone that's doing a little bit more testing to make sure that the stuff is going to work and it's secure, and I landed on Manjaro. And then you could like go through multiple Linux distros that kind of back themselves all the way up to like the really easy like Ubuntu kind of flavors that do that. So I think there's a spectrum, and I think it's an important security discussion to have as to where you want to be, how bleeding edge do you want to be, and how safe do you want to be, like all the way back to our Red Hat discussion of backporting, kernels. Like it's a decision you have to make, and it's not an easy one. And with Linux, none of the paths are really, they're all fraught with peril. Is that a Monty Python kind of reference, right? They're all fraught with peril. No matter what Linux distribution you pick, they're all fraught with peril. There, you can quote that.
So I think, to go back to your original question, I remember back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was first doing Sun OS administration, or BSD 4.3, or System 5, the patch sets when they came out were not, or updates weren't really tested to work together. And if you didn't have any guarantee that things would keep working after you applied them, but you could get the source. Somewhere, and it was before 95, you started seeing bundles for like Solaris that worked together, and HPUX did the same thing, and Windows followed suit eventually. They did a little bit behind, but they were trying to get NT out the door at that time. NT, was it 3.5, the one that actually worked? No slight to Microsoft. That was like a major, giving birth. So I'm not slighting Microsoft. They were working hard, but oh my God. But even after then, though, you turn on the Linux light. And when we had our Yagstall and Slackware, it was the wild, wild west. But now you had people like Red Hat emerge where it had a more of a stable platform. It's not got the latest stuff, but it's going to keep working, and that's great for your business apps. Whereas I can put an app on a version on Paul's desktop that he may have 200 patches a day, but he's happy as a clam because all the latest stuff works.
Right.
Or maybe he wants to back off a little bit.
It's more important that the latest stuff works, and also the ability to create virtual environments for the latest stuff to work. Right. Like when I do a Python install on my desktop, for example, it's a virtual environment 100% of the time, because then you can't. Actually, I'm in Manjaro, like in Arch, like you can't mess with they make a delineation between the system packages that you install Python versus your virtual environment. Like they basically force you into a virtual environment. Go was kind of a similar thing. They kind of force you into almost like a virtual environment for that kind of stuff. I think NixOS is the future of that, where like everything is basically a virtual environment. And Nix is on my list of stuff I really want to learn and check out. I think there's a learning curve there, which is why I haven't gone there. And some of our listeners are like, what do you mean you haven't done like Nix? Nix is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I get it. And it likely is, right? But there's a learning curve there, right? So I think we're progressing towards the point where if it depends on your use case. Do you want a stable server? Or do you want something that you want to have the latest tools? Those are two totally different paths.
All right, Paul.
Right?
Mm-hmm. All right. Here's the deal, though. If I work for a Fortune 500 company, what is more important, keeping prod running or having all of the security vulnerabilities
I think
fixed?
keeping prod running.
Exactly.
I mean, you didn't even get that sentence out, Josh. Like keeping prod running would be my priority.
Point out,
that
Josh,
would be my
keeping prod running
100%.
means that you're managing, at least to manage the security vulnerabilities well enough to keep prod running.
Yeah.
Just pointing that out.
Yeah. And
or you're
just
keeping
with
prod running.
like
you got to keep prod running, but like when you want tools that you want to experiment with, you're going to go down a completely different path. And I love that the Linux environments have progressed to the point where we have options for that. We can keep prod running and have distros that do that, and we can keep the bleeding edge. Two totally different things. Don't mix those two.
That's right.
For those of you listeners out, like, don't mix those two. Right?
And actually, that's an interesting way to answer Jeff's question from before. Like we moved from stay at one cycle behind in terms of patches and updates and upgrades to stay on not bleeding edge per se, but leading edge software.
Yes. Yeah, agreed.
When the vulnerability and malicious authors were able to keep up. And so we had to be as stable as we could with as least vulnerabilities as we could. And sometimes those are two different things, to Paul's point.
Mhm.
And so
Well,
but that's the way
I
we
wonder
went.
if it's as simple as, in the early days it was Unix, and there were a few major players, and they put out updates and releases pretty infrequently, and they sort of pushed it out to the users, the consumers, to figure out whether it was going to break anything. Whereas it seems like now in the Linux world, there's more sensitivity or responsiveness or responsibility for, if we're going to put out an upgrade, we're going to try to take into account, what might be the impact to our users and applications that are running on our systems. Maybe it's oversimplifying, but it seems like there's certainly a different mindset between. I mean, does Sun exist anymore? I don't think
No,
so.
but I want to go. I have a couple stories that go kind of below the OS, but I think that the discussion about your OS is important, and I think that from my perspective, where I decided to like spend a lot of my time and work is below the OS, and I think I want to start with like really below the OS in UEFI, and we've got two stories on that. One is one that Eclipsium actually found a vulnerability in UEFI. Sam, I think you covered this story, and you were like, "I know Paul has like a lot more information on this, and I want to convey a lot more information than what our blog post actually said because I was involved with. Well, I work with people who are amazing in UEFI, so don't like take this as like, oh, Paul's really smart. No, my coworkers are really smart, and we built really smart software. And one of the pieces of software we built was this the thing that we call Automata in our product that looks for like basically 0-day vulnerabilities in UEFI software, and we found one. And so I was involved with the like analysis of this. And again, I talked to my coworker like Jesse Michael about like what this really means. And much of what I'm about to say is because of Jesse and the really smart people that I work with. So we call this UEFI ICANN has buffer overflow. And it's essentially a very what I would call traditional UEFI buffer overflow in that it's in the get variable function in UEFI. So in UEFI, which is the kind of modern BIOS, you have these things that are called variables, and much of what a lot of the vulnerabilities in UEFI are reading a variable because you're basically reading data from an unstructured source, which, as we all know, leads to buffer overflows. So when I saw this one, I was like, oh, it doesn't surprise me that it's get variable because it's almost always the source of UEFI buffer overflows. This particular, so UEFI defines variables. This particular variable is in your TPM configuration and defines a bunch of parameters on how your TPM is configured. And I don't want to like make it so that like it's not a TPM vulnerability, it's a vulnerability in UEFI. So the code was really interesting. If you look at the code, and it's in our automated system that actually discovered this vulnerability, which I think is amazing because it's a programming mistake that all of us would make, right? It's a, hey, the buffer's too small, so I need to allocate a new buffer. Except when I allocated the new buffer, I used the variable name of the previous buffer that was too small. I mean, that's really what the when you look at the code, I should have put it out there as more of a challenge of like spot the buffer overflow because and I'm sounding really smart when I explain this, but it's only because my coworkers explained it to me, and I was like, oh, I see it now. Like they didn't allocate a new buffer, like a larger buffer. They used the previous one. So with UEFI variables, there are security policies that dictate like when and like who can change the value of that buffer overflow. So if you can control this particular UEFI variable, you could exploit this vulnerability. So there's a bunch of, and this isn't in our post. This is me talking to our one of our researchers, Jesse Michael, who's an amazing security researcher, and also like one of the nicest people you ever want to meet in your life. And so in talking with Jesse, I developed this thing. So basically, it occurs in a UEFI variable that defines configuration for your TPM. And if an attacker can control the value of that variable, exploitation is possible given the code that was existent in UEFI. If the variable does not exist in your implementation, because don't forget, like Intel creates the reference implementation of EDK2, OEMs and BIOS manufacturers take that code and they customize it. So AMI, Phoenix, Inside would be the BIOS manufacturers, like Dell, HP, Lenovo would be the OEMs. Like all of those have kind of a hand in how this is implemented on your system. And so if this variable doesn't exist, you could totally create it. An attacker with administrative privileges on the system could create this variable and control the value of it and therefore exploit the overflow. If the variable security policy, so there's more to it than this, but basically I'll break it down to two different security policies. There's runtime, which means once the operating system is loaded, me as a user, an administrative user, I can change the value of that variable. And that's a runtime variable. So this is for things like, let's say you need to update your revocation list for secure boot. Those variables need to be controlled by the user in the operating system to apply the update. And so that would be a runtime variable. So if this variable, and it was like TCG configuration was the name of the variable, if that is set with the security policy that it's a runtime variable, in user in the operating system with administrative privileges can change the value and potentially overflow the exploit, overflow the vulnerability, I should say. So then if the variable is defined as boot services, think of that as configuration that you can only change if you boot your system and you push the special key escape F2, F11, or whatever, you get into your BIOS, and then you can change the value. That's before the operating system is loaded. That's a boot services security policy, which means basically like I need to be physically at the system. I need to push F11 and that can change the value of that variable. If the operating system is loaded and the variable is set to boot services, you can't change that value unless there's another vulnerability that allows you to change that value. So it kind of goes like that, right? Like the variable is defined. You can't like define it again with a different set of permissions kind of thing. And so when you read the line in the blog post that says like exploitation of this vulnerability is going to depend on the configuration of the system from your BIOS manufacturer and or from your OEM, that's the kind of backstory. It gets into like the nitty gritty of UEFI variables and their permissions. So this was a fun one that I got to help out with. That was pretty awesome that our automated software found and our team analyzed and was like, yeah, this is really a vulnerability. Phoenix recognized it as a vulnerability, issued a CVE, and then of course has to put that in the supply chain. So whoever Phoenix supplied this BIOS that had this vulnerability has to then issue a new UEFI BIOS update that you then have to apply. So it was super fun. And the register did not like what we called it. They said that was the most terrible name of any vulnerability ever, which I love, by the way. Josh giving the thumbs up, right? I was telling the internal team, I'm like,
there's no,
this is
yeah,
great. Like, I
there's no better
love that the
compliment.
register hated this name because I think it's awesome.
Yeah, of all news organizations, if the register complains about
Yeah.
the name you gave it,
I was
you know
like,
you did it right.
That was awesome.
I mean,
Yeah,
come on.
that was
If the Epoch Times complains, you probably did a good thing too. So, you know.
So Phoenix didn't just send you a do not publish letter and threaten you.
They did not. No, because Phoenix, AMI, Inside are all great to work with. We'll just,
Yeah.
I'm gonna,
I don't want to dominate this
I don't want to like
conversation,
speak
Paul.
for
But
Eclipsium. This is Paul speaking in my most politically correct stance that Phoenix, AMI, and Inside largely are amazing to work with. They have great people that we've worked with several times in the past, right? And they want to do the right thing. Everything I've seen, they want to do the right thing and recognize vulnerabilities and get them fixed. So,
All right, Paul, I have a
Yeah.
slight tangent to ask you about. You said you have an automated system that found this. Are there like details or an explanation
Yeah.
of this somewhere? Because that sounds
So-
fascinating to me. I
No,
don't
no.
want to dominate like this
No,
particular
if you
segment.
go to our
but
blog, we
that's
have
amazing.
a couple of posts that explain. Well, one post that explains
Okay,
automata, which is what we called our processes. So we used open source and proprietary methods to evaluate UEFI software to discover vulnerabilities. We call it like it's basically like a researcher in a box, right? Like everything we know about at Eclipsium discovering UEFI vulnerabilities, we automated to the best of our ability to find these things. And this is I don't know what I can say publicly. It's not the first one, right? Like we developed this method and it's finding
Nice.
stuff and we're responsibly disclosing it and working with vendors to get it fixed. Yeah. It's a great question, Josh. Yeah. I was super excited when I learned about it. I'm like, this is great. Like you guys are awesome. The founders obviously have a rich history in working at Intel, working with UEFI, discovering vulnerabilities. And so all of that kind of culminates in our research team doing this kind of stuff, which I think is awesome. But also kind of speaks to a segue into a proposed vulnerability in the Grub bootloader, right? So like UEFI loads before your bootloader. It's a much more complex process. You can find it in many slides and a lot of Black Hat talks and things like that. Like once you push the power button on your PC, from that point in time until you get a login screen in your operating system, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens. I'll simplify it into like UEFI stuff happens, and then bootloader stuff happens, and then like your operating system kernel is loaded, and then the rest of your operating system. So what I just described in a UEFI vulnerability is very early stage vulnerability. What I'm about to describe is when boot services in UEFI passes it off to the bootloader, like the last step in your what we would traditionally call a BIOS or UEFI in more modern terms. When it goes, hey, I'm done like initializing all the hardware and doing all the things so the operating system can load, I'm going to pass it off to a bootloader, and then the bootloader loads the kernel, which then loads your operating system. So in this case, my story number 15, there is a rumor. I'm going to call it a rumor, right? I don't know if this really exists, but let's just say the person on this darknet forum is purportedly selling a 0-day vulnerability in privilege escalation vulnerability in the Grub bootloader. So that's in that process, right? In your bootloader. And I don't know if this exists or not. Just throw that out there. I don't know if this is real. I've not heard anything that says this is real. All I know is that there are reports that on a kind of underground forum, if you will, that someone's purporting to sell a vulnerability for the Grub bootloader. I want to say this one was 90,000. This was 90,000. I want to say when we talked about this internally, that what we gleaned was it was $90,000 because we were talking about like, hey, can we go buy it so we can write detections for it? And I'm like, well, it's not like $20, it's like $90,000. And we're like, yeah, probably above the threshold that we want to just go buy to like validate, right? So
You could offer them $20 and see if they bite.
Well, they had a
right,
zero
we can make an
day
offer
for Grub. They'd be handing it
Make
over
an
to the
offer.
Gruck for about $1 million.
Yeah. So, but like a vulnerability in your bootloader, I just want to, from what I've learned working at Eclipsium, I'm on my like 2-year anniversary working at
Oh,
Eclipsium.
hey,
with the-
congratulations.
yeah, thank you. With an amazing team. Like I love working there, and the team is amazing. So here's what I know: if there's a vulnerability in your bootloader, it means like an attacker with root. Let's just talk about Linux for a moment. An attacker with root privileges can certainly affect the bootloader. I think it's one of my most famous like social media posts ever is like my meme about like Windows that says, hey, I want to remove Edge. And Windows is like, I can't let you do that. And then you ask Linux, you're like, hey, I want to delete my bootloader. And Linux is like, sure, you can do that. Totally fine. Right? Like if you're root on Linux, you can totally manipulate and or delete your bootloader. The problem with that is a couple of problems with that. One, someone's may notice that. Two, if you have secure boot enabled and you've given the system a new bootloader that's not been validated with secure boot's going to halt the boot process and go, that doesn't pass the checks. That bootloader is in DBX or it's not in the DB. Therefore, I'm not going to boot the system. An exploit for a bootloader that has signature is not in the revocation list allows an attacker to execute code before the kernel loads. And that's extremely important. It's a great delineation, right? Like as an attacker, I'm on the system and maybe I'm root, which is one level of privilege. If I want to get even more privilege, I want to attack the bootloader because that's bootloader code loads before the operating system. So it gives them pre-kernel access to your system, even if your bootloader is validated with secure boot. So like you're running a system, it's got grub, secure boot goes, that version of grub is totally fine. But as an attacker, I can execute an exploit that takes over that bootloader. Secure boot doesn't matter because secure boot's like, yeah, everything's fine. As an attacker, I'm like, well, I'm executing code before the kernel. If you can execute code before the kernel, any security controls that you have on your system that are in the kernel or thereafter, so EDR, any kind of antivirus, any kind of kernel protections that might exist or monitoring that might exist in your kernel is out the window. As an attacker, I can get around that. I can circumvent that. I can turn that off. And I can also persist in your system to a certain extent. Like with a bootloader, your like EFI partition in Windows, like as an example, right? Like you would have to rewrite your EFI partition to wipe out my malware, right? So the deeper level of persistence is in UEFI, which happens before your bootloader. So a grub exploit gives an attacker some level of persistence and pre-operating system code execution with the ability to disable operating system protections that exist in your kernel or anything after, like your EDR. If
There's
your EDR
nothing
is on
wrong with your
kernel or not.
bootloader. Do not attempt to adjust the image.
Right.
We are now controlling the transmission. We control the
Again,
horizontal and the vertical.
Right. And again, I'm not saying this exploit is real or not. Like we haven't validated it, but there has been a history of vulnerabilities in grub that we have exploited. One is Boothole, which was found by Eclipsium researchers before I started, which is awesome.
It's probably real. I mean, look, this is the Evil Maid attack, right? And grub is a super complicated piece of software. Like it's full of bugs.
Wouldn't they be asking more?
Well, it's complicated, but it goes back to our conversation with the Linux kernel, right, Josh? Like Josh, like it's complicated. Like the reason we have grub is because we need to tell the kernel all kinds of things. We want to have extensibility. We want to have configuration. And so we want our bootloader to tell the kernel all kinds of different things. All
grub
the different
is just the autoexec.bat of Linux, okay? Let's be honest.
It's a great point. You actually don't need grub. You can totally load your Linux kernel from UEFI if you want to, go research all those tutorials and do all the thing and do all that stuff. And your kernel is pretty static.
I don't think you can.
I don't recommend it, Josh.
You'd have to sign it.
You'd have to sign it.
And that's
if you have a secure boot,
shim,
yes.
Because shim is signed, shim loads grub, and then grub loads
secure
Linux.
boot aside. I mean, you could validate all that in secure boot.
Without secure
boot aside. So I could create my own root of trust, right, for all the things. But you could also, from UEFI, skip the bootloader process and just load the Linux kernel directly. Now, you'd have to tell it how you want to load the Linux kernel, which is why grub exists.
Right.
So you'd have to have pretty static Linux kernel to do that, but you can totally do it. I mean, I've looked at tutorials, and I'm like, I don't know that I'd recommend that to people, but totally possible.
You can do it, doesn't mean you should, one.
It doesn't mean you should, right. You can also control your entire secure boot key hierarchy and sign all of the software yourself. Yes. And that's one of the beauties of secure boot. Totally
really
do that.
Crappy idea.
Exactly. I don't
Okay.
recommend that you do that. I've looked into it in all
No,
the articles I've
don't
written
do
for
that.
Eclipsium. I'm like, you can do
Sam
this, but
does
you
that.
totally, you
Nobody
should
else should,
not.
okay?
You should not. Arch Linux and
don't do
Manjaro
it.
recommends
Alright,
that you do that. Like if you want secure boot, that's what you have to do because they don't support shim. All their distributions support shim, which is
Jesus
a small
Christ.
bootloader that UEFI passes off to shim, and shim is signed, and shim has the other certificates to sign your bootloader and your kernel after that, which is how Ubuntu and a lot of other distributions do it. And then you could have a lot of fighting on like Hacker News and fight people on the internet as to why your solution is or not is the right solution for secure boot. But anyway.
All right, why don't we talk about the price? Because Josh, not me, said he thinks 90K is too low. Here's my suspicion on this. So there's a book by a person named Nicole Perloff called "This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends," which everyone should read if you haven't read.
It's okay. Yeah, I have some issues. I have
Really?
some issues with
All right.
it.
Well, we'll have to talk about that at some point. But here's the thing: if you're posting something like this on like some random forum, you've probably tried to contact, we'll say, people who may be interested in this, and they passed, right?
Oh, that's a good point.
Which tells me they either have one already or they think you're a clown.
But that's a great point.
And it could be either of those.
I have one already, or I don't trust you, and I don't believe that you have what you say you have, or what you have is not as impactful, or just like doesn't hit my goals. Right? It doesn't help me hit my goals.
I bet they have one already.
Right? You're going with.
I think they have one already. Yeah.
Sam, you got articles. Pick one.
I've got a couple that I thought were pretty interesting. The one is about matrix multiplication in AI models. This is one of the really computationally expensive steps. And these researchers have discovered that you don't need to do matrix multiplication. You can do it another way, which is really not that surprising. I mean, the single neurons don't have to interact in any particular way with the others. They just have to interact and then they will learn. And so they claim they can do large language models with much less power. And it reminds me of another study that came out a couple of weeks ago where they found you could take the high precision math done to calculate the output of a neuron in a large language model, and you could quantize it down to just 2 or 1 bit, and it still works almost as well.
Hold on, Sam. What is the concept of a neuron in an AI LLM model?
It's analogous to a neuron in the brain. It's a object that takes input from all the neurons in the layer before it and combines them, usually by linear calculation, and then puts an output to the next layer. And you just
it sounds like it's what helps it kind of almost think like humans.
Well, that's the idea, but it is a very simplified, cartoonish imitation. The problem is that it's designed against a very sort of cartoonish model of how the human brain works, but LLMs
you mean it's by cartoonish model, you mean like a bunch of if statements?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's essentially a software object that just combines input from, say, all the neurons in a layer before it. Like you often have maybe 128 neurons in a layer and another 128 neurons. And it's just a data structure that takes data from all the other neurons before it and combines them with a whole bunch of parameters. And then you can adjust all those parameters to make it do whatever you want. And so it's just a versatile learning system, which is what we are, really. But but there's no particular reason to think that the math has to be done with such great precision at each stage. It's the combination of the many neurons that make it powerful. So this, what this implies is,
like the Borg, almost like the Borg.
Yeah, like Borgs or ants. I mean, it's each one can do very little, but the combination of all of them working together.
I like that I was right. Josh is laughing, but like I like that I was kind of sort of right on
that.
It's
cool.
I was just guessing.
I mean, look, Borg jokes always work, right?
And you know what this means? NVIDIA was briefly the richest company in the world, and their value rose larger than any other company in the world because
what do you mean briefly? I thought they were. I think
they already fell down to 2 or 3, but I'm not sure.
I thought our economy was being.
Yeah, they'll be back.
I thought our
economy
was being held up by NVIDIA for a time.
It was. Well, they were the number one, and then people took the profit, which I recommend because, I'm just not that clear that everybody's going to need all those GPUs. What these guys found is you can do just as well with a custom FPGA chip that uses much less power.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
So, the next generation of AIs may not be requiring so many of those expensive GPUs.
I want to talk about, Sam, your story number 3, a new
Yeah.
Wi-Fi attack against Windows systems.
Yeah.
What I
getting a
love
lot of
about
press.
this attack, like one of the, I think, pivotal moments, like the great vulnerabilities that we've talked about in the show, comes back to my good friend Dave Maynor and his counterpart at the time, Johnny Cash, when they were talking about Wi-Fi driver vulnerabilities. And
Right.
the Apple community at the time was like poo-pooing it. And what's astounding to me is your story number 3 underscores the methods in which this vulnerability could be exploited.
Yeah.
Because Larry and I happened to be like right place, right time in researching and understanding Wi-Fi networks and how they worked. And we were like, wait, like a vulnerability in a Wi-Fi driver just means that me as an attacker, I just need to be in proximity to the target. It doesn't matter if they have the best security in the world, if they have passwords, if they're on the most encrypted Wi-Fi network. In the driver, if I'm on the same channel Wi-Fi as that victim, I can inject frames that overflow a buffer in their driver. And what's astounding to me, and I actually sent this to Dave Maynor. I'm like, dude, I'm thinking of you. Because this is, but Apple, like, they came after Dave and Johnny Cash at that time and tried to poo-poo them, tried to get their talk pulled, the whole thing.
Oh, yeah.
And what Microsoft describes in this article is exactly how this type of attack works. Like, basically, if I'm in a Wi-Fi proximity to an attacker, I'm totally screwed. And Microsoft said that in this article.
But Steve Gibson pointed out something that I thought was really clever today. To consider something like that Zyxl vulnerability. I don't really have to be near you. I just need to take over
Right.
an access point that's near you.
Right. No. IoT vulnerabilities work in the same way. Larry and I postulated years ago that these vulnerabilities that are on the inside just means I need to take over your phone or a device. And once I'm on your Wi-Fi network, I can take advantage. We've speculated, right? Pivot. We've speculated the pivot for sure.
Yeah, I was really surprised when the NSA exploits leaked and they were all attacking routers and firewalls. The edge devices. I thought that wasn't so common, but that's increasingly what you do. You attack the edge devices.
This article, there was some things in this article that I wanted to highlight.
Like what?
It's hotels, trade shows, security updates. There were certain things. Does not require an attacker to have physical access to the target computer, although physical proximity is needed. Exploiting this vulnerability can allow an unauthenticated attacker to gain remote code execution on an impacted device. You just need to be in proximity because it's a layer 2 attack. Like, the driver is accepting kind of the layer 2 stuff. And what a lot of the 20 years ago Apple fanboys were postulating was totally wrong. We're like, no. Doesn't mean I don't even need to know your Wi-Fi name. I certainly don't need to know your password. As long as I can transmit 802.11 frames on the same channel as the victim, I can compromise your computer. This is exactly this attack. And all the articles I read now today, which I'm actually thankful for, are like, you need to patch this vulnerability. 20 years ago, they were like, oh, it's just security researchers being security researchers and hyping it up. Like, I'm glad we came to the point where, like, oh shit. Like, if you go to a hotel or a conference and you're like adjacent to all these Wi-Fi devices, like, you're going to get pwned.
And it's so simple. It's just the SSID being longer than 255 characters in the beacon frame.
How does that happen? Like, how does someone
Like
writing a driver make a mistake like that?
Yeah, just like the other one you posted.
It's written in C.
It's
Paul.
It's like the UEFI vulnerability. It's like, well, the buffer's too small, so I'm going to allocate a new buffer, but I really allocated the old buffer that was too small. right?
How
Yeah.
many
That's
how
right.
many coders get secure coding training?
Very few.
Both
I
of
en-
them.
we had a
That's
visitor
great.
from Netflix come to our class, and I asked him, "Would you like to hire some of our students as interns?" He said, "No, we don't hire anybody straight out of school because there's no program in the world that teaches them how to write secure code. We don't even look at the application unless you have 5 years of real industry experience coding, because only real combat teaches you to write secure code." And I think
I
that's
would
still true.
disagree. I would honestly disagree because I think
Yeah.
that there's a significant number of programmers that have been at this for 5 years or more that still don't write secure code
Oh,
because
sure.
they're not the ones that fix their damn code.
Sure. It's a
They leave
necessary
it
but
to
not
some
sufficient
WAF
condition.
and some
Yeah.
poor, security dipshit sitting in a sock somewhere freaking out trying to keep the WAF updated.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, he didn't say he would hire you absolutely if you had 5 years experience. He said he wouldn't even look at your application unless you had 5 years experience.
And remember, 5 years is entry level these days, just to be clear. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's like a whole different segment. in of
Sorry,
itself,
I
to
know,
be
but I
hon-
couldn't
no,
resist.
to be honest, but like, I know people that write code that have like the number of years of experience is a moot point, right? Like in both directions, right?
Well, I mean, up
It's
until probably a
And-
year ago, everybody was like, "Go write code. You'll always make amazing money. At the very worst, you'll make decent money." And I'm like, AI will take your gerb.
yeah.
Well, and look, I think there's another angle to stories like this because you're seeing more and more weird, like hardware and networking and Wi-Fi and radio stories. Is the gear to do stuff like this? You can get in a cereal box now. This used to be like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of gear 20 years ago.
Mom,
Yeah,
I got a
it's
bus
nuts.
pirate in the cereal.
No, in 2005,
That's
Larry
right,
and I
yeah.
were looking into 802.11 security, and even like years prior, like up until 2005, and it was really expensive, right? To acquire the gear
Yeah,
to be able
yeah.
to execute some of these attacks was really expensive. The cost since then, in the past 20 years, like what is an ESP32? $1.34 from
they're free.
AliExpress, right?
Yeah, they're free.
And
They're
you can
literally
write your
free.
own code
Look
and interact with 802.11 for like $1.
That's right.
It's that's gone from like
Look at
that's
the
gone from
Flipper
like
Zero.
$10,000 to $20,000 to $1 in 20 years,
Yeah.
roughly. Like
Yeah.
I'm maybe not exaggerating, but like that's rough estimate. That's pretty amazing. I want to talk about hey Sam, I don't know if you saw my story number 21, reconstructing public keys from signatures. I want to delve into an encryption and cryptography for a moment. I know we lost Jeff because I think his battery
Yeah.
died on his laptop, but I read the title and then I tried to read the article, and like I really wanted to understand this post, and
Well-
I just couldn't. And what I gleaned from that is that from a signature, you can derive the public key.
Yeah.
And they even pointed out in the article, like you can go to Wikipedia and understand that this is possible. And all I could glean from that was basically you could read the title and glean from what I gleaned from it is that from a signature, you can like work your way back to gleaning a public key. But
there's some differences.
but like the
when I
math
say-
and all the formulas
Yeah.
are super fascinating to me, and I don't pretend to understand it. And I'm like, oh, that's so cool. But it's also very similar to, I'm gonna give you the floor in a moment, Sam, but where I was working with SSL certificates, and I think I don't remember what it was. If I had a private key for like multiple private keys for multiple SSL certificates, and I wanted to like match which one went with which, and there was like a mathematical way that I could work my way backwards to understand which private key went with which public key or something like that. And then I researched it and I read an article. It was the same as this article. A lot of mathematical formulas. I'm like, holy crap, I don't understand that. But they gave me the OpenSSL command to like identify like this private key goes with this like public key, and there was a bunch of math involved. And I just think all of that is so fascinating. I don't understand it to the level of this article, but
Well, the math is not that complicated, and this has no security significance, I think, because the public key
yeah.
is not a secret. But it is
Yeah.
a useful thing to know. And for example, for RSA, you use the least common denominator algorithm.
It's a
Yeah,
reverse factoring exercise to
yeah,
match the yeah. I
yeah.
get that.
So it's nice. They do show how to do it for many things, including post quantum ones. So I mean, this
Yeah, I thought that was
also
interesting. This
users.
one they also
Yeah,
went into post quantum
yeah,
algorithms as well.
yeah. So I mean,
Algorithms as well. Yeah.
I think this is useful as sort of just practice in manipulating the terms and doing the math involved in these encryption schemes. But it's sort of useful to know. But I don't think any.
Math is, when we
Go ahead.
talk about this kind of encryption schemes in math, it's amazing to me. It's pretty awesome, right? Like someone like mapped all this out and defined it, and
Oh yes,
it distills down to us and like tools of going. I can go from a signature to a public key. I can go match a private key with and it's beautiful.
The math is on
truly,
asymmetric is gorgeous.
dude.
It
It's
is
totally.
absolutely
I don't
mesmerizingly
pretend to
beautiful.
understand it,
Yes.
but I'm like, I'm just astounded by it. It's
Yep.
amazing.
Well, the post quantum stuff is really mind bending, and I've been teaching all the time, trying to get people to start to
Right.
get used to it. It's learning with errors. So you add random errors to the encryption, so people can't reverse it easily, which is pretty awesome.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Also, an article along these lines is that amazed me was my story number 19. SSH is a pseudo replacement. Like someone went into the details as to how you could use SSH to replace pseudo.
Wait, what?
And it's an experiment where using SSH locally to perform the same role as pseudo without exposing the SSHD instance to the network.
I
I haven't delved into all the details.
Oh,
I'm not sure like it all checks out. I'm assuming it does, but I
Yeah.
was like,
yeah, it does.
that's
No, I think
really
it's brilliant, and I think he needed to do the last step of just renaming his script pseudo and deleting the original pseudo, and then you would never notice that this is what's actually happening.
Right.
What pseudo actually does under the hood is a terrible thing you shouldn't be doing. He's right about that.
Right.
You use a set UID.
I think there's a lot of I've seen like Linux like hero, I would call them Linux heroes, right? That are like, why do we need pseudo necessarily? Like the whole model is flawed, and it just like permeated its way into the way we do administration. And like, why wouldn't you just have like authenticate as root and be root to do what you need to do? Why do we need to like pass the authentication to a regular user to do like super user level privilege stuff? Like,
Well, you don't want them staying root all the time. It's like the whole point of Microsoft's user account
right.
control.
But I think like good IT practices is like, I've got my root shell and I do my root things, and then they got my user things and I do my user things, and I can delete. Like it comes down to like a human thing, right?
Well, Microsoft Windows 2000 had official recommendation you should never log in as an administrator. You should right-click Run As and log in for just one command.
And
And
no one did that.
everybody
Right.
ignored that. So they invented
Yes.
user account control, which is basically pseudo, where you escalate for just one command and then you fall back down to low privileges. That seems to be the winning technique in practice for normal people.
Yeah, but how many people run as root all the bloody time because it's easier?
I hope not too many anymore, but I don't know. It would be kind of fun to get like a survey or something.
I want to just go back for a moment. I want to go into have you folks used like open source UEFI or firmware systems like Coreboot?
I have not recently. I played with them earlier when they sucked.
So I found this article that was like, you should ditch proprietary BIOS UEFI systems and you should use these open source alternatives. And the reason for this post is basically a combination of security and privacy. And they blend the two together. And I think my issue with it is you need to separate the two, right? So they say that like proprietary firmware contains backdoors that compromise user privacy. Hardware manufacturers intentionally integrate these backdoors into their closed source firmware for obvious reasons. This prevents a serious privacy issue, promoting open source community and privacy advocates to develop secure open source boot firmware. I want to disagree. Like, I want to just throw the disagreement out there as a first thing. And I want to separate privacy from security. So when you're looking at open source BIOS UEFI, I believe it does provide a privacy aspect to it, not a security aspect to it, because open source firmware does not necessarily improve security, but it does enhance privacy, right? Because we can all go look at the source code and validate doesn't have backdoors, it doesn't have a commercial entity like associated with it, and that's one thing. But it still contains vulnerabilities. Like, I think a lot of people are trying to adopt core boot and what are the other ones?
Like Tiano Core.
No, Tiano Core is the reference implementation, but the
gotcha.
other one is I can't remember the name of it. But
Okay, so
Core boot is the shining example. Like, people are like, I want to run open source firmware that boots my system because it's more secure, and that's not necessarily true. Like, open source software contains vulnerabilities. Like I said in my opening statement, like, open source doesn't mean it's more secure. It just means, yeah, we could look at it and discover vulnerabilities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's looking at it. And there's a small, in terms of people that exist on the planet today that work in technology, that understand source code, that are looking at UEFI and like core boot, which deviated from UEFI, supports UEFI in like a compatibility mode, but like boots the system. Like, how many people understand that? Like, what percentage of the population understands that well enough to go, there's security vulnerabilities in it?
It's time for you to reread Reflections on Trusting Trust from Ken Thompson, I think,
that
Paul.
is my favorite. That might be one of my favorite papers of all time.
Compiling the compiler, the compiler.
It was
I compiled the
1984.
compiler.
Ken Thompson published that in 1984, dude. It is one of the seminal works in our...
It's more true now than it was then.
That's the scary thing. He wrote about supply chain attacks in 1984.
But like, Ken should win, be honored for publishing that paper so many years ago. Like, it honored in ways that we haven't even figured out how to honor people.
Why can't we have a show about him? We should. No. I'm serious. We should honor him on Paul's Security Weekly. Does anybody know when he actually published it?
How old is Ken Thompson now? He's like 80 something years old. No?
Is he as old as Lee?
I don't know about that.
Oh, it's like, oh my God, my bucket list would be to have him on the show.
So make it happen.
Well, he was born in 1943.
Yeah.
Nice.
He ain't a youngin'.
Couple days older than me.
Couple days.
Right?
Couple days.
Well, regarding this core boot stuff, I wonder how many realistic attacks is this really going to stop? And if you were to deploy this at your company, how hard would it be to support? How reliable is it? Well,
here's the thing. Like, the hardware that's supported by the open source UEFI software is minimal. Libre OS is one of the other ones. And look, I'm not knocking these projects. I think from a privacy standpoint, 100%, right? Disassociate yourself from the commercial firmware and go to open source has a privacy benefit. I don't think it has a security benefit. I really don't, because vulnerabilities persist in open source software just as much as they persist in commercial software.
Yeah.
That's just, like, we only deface facts. That's a fact. And so adopt this, yes, for a privacy perspective, but again, your hardware is going to be very limited. Like, the amount of hardware that's going to support core boot, Libre, you're going to have to go to a specific Linux vendor, totally fine. Do that. Like if you want to do that, I think it's totally fine. But it's not going to provide you with a higher level of security because all software has vulnerabilities, commercial, open source or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a thing. Anyway,
It's just who do you want to go to get them fixed? Who do you trust to take care of those vulnerabilities?
I mean, XZ also highlighted that open source software is also vulnerable to supply chain attacks. Back to Ken Thompson's paper, right? Like the XZ attack, like highlighted like new methods and ways in which attackers can embed themselves into projects to execute a supply chain attack. And that's actually more common in open source software that allows contributors from all over the world, right, to contribute to the software. It's almost to their detriment.
I think there's a second side to this, though, Paul. And if you look at something like XZ is used by almost everyone who uses Linux today, and even people who don't. So you had millions of eyeballs unknowingly gazing upon XZ, and one of them happened to notice this weird thing. Whereas if you have core boot, and if you only have hundreds or thousands of people looking at it, you lose that like many eyeballs angle.
Holy
which
crap,
I still
dude.
think like
it's less eyeballs that are looking at things like core boot than other software.
Right.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's a great point.
Right, it's like the inverse of Raymond's law, where yes, all like open source could have many eyeballs make all bugs shallow, unless there's no eyeballs, and then it doesn't matter how many,
But also like eyeballs that understand UEFI software in the boot process is even less than something like XZ, for example, right? Like that's
right.
frightening to me, actually.
And even XZ had one person noticed out of how many people?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the thing is like, don't use open source software and think you're more secure. By all means, use open source. Use core boot. Like I'm not saying don't use core boot. Use it, but don't think you're more secure in doing that. Use it because it's a privacy benefit. Agree, 100%. Like there's no commercial entity. There's no. I've seen things in specifically UEFI in commercial software that could contribute to like a privacy violation kind of thing. Like by all means, use it to be more free, and in a privacy context, don't do it because like, I'm more secure. Because like all software is vulnerable, man. Like don't make that mistake. That's my narrative on this one.
Unless it's written in Rust, and then it has no security issues.
No security issues. What everything written in Rust, dude, is like
that's right.
Totally fine. Totally fine.
Y'all are funny.
That's right.
Oh boy. Oh, we didn't talk about the Red Hat Linux kernel module, did we? Did we cover that?
Yeah,
already?
we talked about
that.
Yeah, we covered that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we talked about that. What haven't we not talked about? Oh, we haven't talked about Velvet Ant.
Okay.
Did you guys hear about Velvet Ant?
No.
So
What's
this
Velvet
was
Ant, Paul?
So this was a basically a forensic investigation about an incident, and they found that the threat actors had compromised F5 Big IP's load balancers as their initial foothold into the network. So what struck me about this story, and there's a lot of things, my story number 18, a lot of things about this story, but what struck me is that I think all of us on the show and listening have been in a similar situation. And in the article, they say this load balancer, this F5 load balancer, was not part of previous remediation efforts because it was not supposed to be operational in the production of the network. One team in the organization started deploying F5 solution in the network a long time ago as part of a disaster recovery plan, but the project was never completed. And these F5 Big IP appliances occupy a trusted position in the network architecture often at the perimeter between different network segments. Then compromising a device gave attackers, they said attackers can exert significant control over network traffic without arousing suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
So many of us have been in this position, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we implement a new technology to solve a problem, and then it's kind of abandoned. It's just kind of out there. And then attackers take control of it. And it's at a critical point in our network. And that was the like staggering point in the story where I was like, oh my God, we've all been there. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We've all been there.
I mean, doesn't this completely tie into the conversation we started with, like way at the beginning about, vulnerability management
Yes.
and
The
asset
dusty
inventories?
corner. This is
and
a
all of
dusty
that?
corner. A dusty corner.
Right.
Dude, so early in my like pen testing vulnerability assessment career, the importance of the dusty corners was high. Like someone said to me in 2004, if you can go into an environment and you can help them find the dusty corners, like you're
Mhm.
going to prove your value. And this is a dusty corner, right? A project that's been abandoned, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Totally true.
And I keep thinking, it's just as a slight turn, we keep seeing stories about blah compromise because their passwords were grabbed. And I'm thinking, how many shops have a couple of folks out there that have been wanting to do MFA or FIDO or whatever the hell, that they never get the thing to do a POC or let alone do an implementation, that if you just like got the hell out of their way, you could raise the bar and they'd be so happy they'd probably do it at light speed. You'd probably have to send somebody around there with a camera to document them because they'll be moving so fast. Or is that just me?
I think you're optimistic about a lot of small to medium shops.
Well, as in, there are not as many who have those two guys in the corner in the back.
I think there's a lot of MSPs.
In the last 2 minutes, I want to change gears and I want to go to
Whiskey.
Julian Assange.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Do you guys follow this story?
Yes.
Yeah.
This caused a lot of research on my end. Like geography is one of them. Like, wait, where was Julian Assange? Where is he going? Where is he going to end up?
Jail.
Who's paying? Like, oh my, the number of questions I have on this whole thing. Like, I also thought that there was a sexual assault allegation from Sweden in the mix.
I think that was seen as bullshit.
Is that?
Well, I don't think so.
No,
He's getting off, but the whole thing is Assange is getting off. Well, all right, I don't want to say he's getting off scot-free, but time served, right? Like essentially, but like it's just a fascinating case. He was at the, oh God, was he in Ecuador? He was in Ecuador.
He was in the Ecuadorian embassy.
Ecuadorian embassy in the UK.
In London.
Yeah, in London.
He hid there.
Yeah.
Yep.
But like
In
he
London.
did bad things there. We
Mhm.
heard a lot though. Like he was basically an asshole.
Yeah. He didn't take care of his cat and stuff.
Something like that. But also there's the allegations from a sexual assault in Sweden. Then there's the charges from the US, right?
And then,
but then he served 5 years in a prison in the UK.
Right.
And not good. So I looked into this because I was just curious, and this is not like in-depth technical analysis, right? But like, it was not a great time he had in the 5 years. He served 5 years in the prison in the UK, in like every day, like maybe an hour of sunlight a day.
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems only reasonable that they gave him time served and let him go. I mean, I would say he suffered enough.
So, but now he has to. This might have already happened. He has to go to, what is the U.S. territory in that area?
Yeah, he went to some territory. He pled guilty. He's off, and now he's back in Australia. He's a free man
Okay,
back in
so
Australia.
he free person in Australia.
Yeah,
right?
he's technically a felon or something. He committed. He confessed to the crime, pled guilty, got punished only with time served, so he got off the hook.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That seems
It was
reasonable to
some
me.
island in the Pacific.
Yeah,
It looks beautiful, by the way. I can't remember the name of it, but like he went from the UK to the island. What is that called? Oh,
And-
Larry
somehow-
Saipan.
Saipan thing.
and somehow
what
they
it is?
claim that he had to take a private jet at a cost of $500,000 that he has to pay. That part sounds pretty bogus to me, but people already made a GoFundMe and raised the money or something. So
Oh my Lord.
Oh my God! Like the story is just, it's a, because like he's also on record as saying like, I've been incarcerated, therefore I haven't been able to like make these war crimes available to the public because I've been incarcerated. Like,
Does that mean there's more coming?
oh my God! Like the whole story with Assange is interesting.
well, even before he went to prison, WikiLeaks was very dysfunctional due to his huge ego. And they had a whole hard drive from some major American company they were going to leak. And the administrators destroyed it because they didn't think they could trust Julian Assange to do the right thing with it. So it was pretty dysfunctional shop anyway.
Oh my God.
So is like WikiLeaks going to come back?
He might try it again. I don't know. If he tries
But
it,
he's going to
he
live
might
in.
not-
He's a free person in Australia
He is.
as of like right
Yeah.
now. Like I
For now,
think he's
yeah.
done his. Has he done his court time in the beautiful
no, he's-
island kind of thing?
Yes,
Which
he
is
has.
just like a procedural thing.
As far
Like
as I know, he's done.
time
he-
served, like
yes.
basically the
Although-
judge's like time served stamp, which is totally fine. Like
Although,
he served his time.
sometimes they have restrictions. I wonder if he tried to start WikiLeaks again, if that would be a violation of restrictions or something.
yeah.
I would like to
Well-
think so. I mean, you don't want him doing it again, for God's sake.
God, like my like pipe dream is we bring Julian on the show and like ask him all, like I have so many burning questions, right?
Oh,
Like
man.
how amazing would it be to like sit with like dude, like start from the beginning, right? It would be like a 3-hour interview, like start because
But-
there was a documentary film, like he was a hacker back in the day
Yeah,
in
But it
was
would
he
be
in
like
Sweden? He was
it would be
the
like
whole-
Donald Trump. You'd have to have live fact checking. I mean, he
Yeah.
would lie a lot.
You think so? Do you think
Oh
so?
yes, his story differs from the stories of other people a lot.
Because there was a movie I watched on some
Yeah.
streaming network about
Yeah.
what was that movie? Josh, you watched it.
No, I didn't watch it, but I know what you mean. Yeah, they made a movie. I forget who played him. Was it? It was someone famous and well known. But anyway, look. So when you interview someone like that, that is one of those instances you let him talk,
Yes.
and that's just you're collecting a story
Give him enough
that
rope
you
to
know is
hang
90%
himself.
bullshit, but it's going to be very fun.
Yeah,
But that's
Like that's how that works.
every interview. You have to let your
That's like when you interview McAfee.
Hey now.
but like Bressers, you know, like when you interview someone, you prompt
Yeah.
them and you let them talk.
Yeah.
there's
right.
that
Yeah.
And Mark,
podcast.
to your
It's their
point,
story.
we interviewed John which is really funny you bring that up. I interviewed John McAfee on the
Oh.
show.
Oh
That's in the
man, how did that
archives.
go?
It went awesome. McAfee was an awesome
He would be-
interview.
He'd be entertaining, but you couldn't really believe it all.
It was amazing. I mean, God rest his soul,
Yeah,
but it was
It
amazing.
was, I'm sure it was bananas. All right, I just looked. The movie's called The Fifth Estate. with
Yes, the
Benedict
Fifth Estate.
Cumberbatch.
Yes,
Benedict
Oh, of
Cumberbatch
course.
was Julian
yes,
Assange.
yeah. Oh,
Which
Doctor
is-
Strange.
Yeah, or
he would've been-
Sherlock, depending
he would've
upon
been a hell of
No,
a job
no,
at
no,
that.
no. Benedict Cumberbatch. What is his name?
He's Dr. Strange.
Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
The most
He,
English name ever.
he is
Yeah,
Doctor
he's
Strange to
Doctor
me.
Strange, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
That's fair.
it is.
He'll
fair.
be Sherlock.
Y'all are
Sherlock
funny.
Holmes was so good.
And the Fifth Estate, right? Like that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Hey, come on, don't
That is-
forget.
that is a.
Imitation
That's from
Game.
2013. That was more than 10 years ago they did
I
that.
know, right?
Holy
Like,
cow.
Oh my
Holy
God, we're
cow.
old.
We need
Well, if
to
you
interview
invite
him to get like the. Oh my God.
If you invite him, he might come. He might have not much to do right now.
Right.
Do it, Paul.
I'm
Do it.
invested.
Do it for all
I'm
of us.
invested though. I'm so intrigued and to get the whole. It's not even a story. Like I just want to.
You'll get a lot of hits.
The question. It's not even about like just to preserve what he's done in hacking and information
Actually,
security,
that's
right?
a really interesting point. Yeah, to have sort of a monumental memorial or something.
Right.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Well, Julian, if you're
That was
listening,
awesome.
we want to talk. We want to have a chat, man.
If
And
anybody
look,
can get in
I'm
touch
gonna
with him, tell him we'd love to interview him.
And I would let him talk. To Bresser's point, right? Like I would let him talk.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just let him go. Be
Right.
amazing.
Well, awesome. Well, folks, thank you for participating in the show this evening, and thank you everyone for listening and watching. That will conclude this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. Over and out.